Welcome to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you burn fat, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey guys, just wanted to give you a quick little message of one of my favorite new product lines out there. Ideal for the low carb athlete to fuel before, during, and after your workouts. This company is called Equip Foods. Equip is one of my favorite supplement brands as they provide some of the shortest ingredients lists in the industry, which is hard to find, with products made from 100% real food, no junk, no chemicals, no artificial flavors or fillers. Their best seller is what I've been using, the Chocolate Prime Protein, which is actually a grass-fed beef protein powder providing a whopping 21 grams of complete protein in each scoop with only 3 ingredients, and you don't even taste them. Grass-fed beef protein, stevia, and cocoa. Now, don't worry, despite its simplicity, it does taste incredible, not like beef. That would not taste good in my shake. Equip also has a 1-ingredient collagen powder made from grass-fed bovine collagen, providing incredible benefits for your joint health, skin, and recovery. Plus more, ideal for the aging athlete. Equip is currently having its biggest sale of the year to date, so if you're interested in checking out Prime Protein, collagen, or any of their other products, as I like the pre-workout WOD before my strength training sessions, get up to 25% off. Head to equipfoods.com/low-carb-athlete. So you can use your code low-carb-athlete and get a deal. Enjoy. Hey, it's Debbie, and I am talking to a fellow podcaster and a big influencer, which I'm not. I love to read the posts and listen to his podcasts. He is the Ketologist Chris Irvine. Super fascinating to me. I feel very old because all these people are like 30 something and I'm suddenly almost 51 now. And these guys and girls out there are doing a lot for educating our low carb community that it's about eating nutrient-dense whole foods that balance your blood sugar. What I've said for years, that's what we learn in Nutritional Therapy Practitioner Program, NTA. And really love how Chris Irvine and Jay Feldman, Ben Greenfield, and everyone's we go to such extremes when people say keto. Everyone does all fat. And then now carnivore. Everyone just eats meat or ideally nose to tail. And then we just kind of have this pendulum swinging back and forth. Vegetarian, vegan, having 0 carbs, avoiding all vegetables. And it's really hard to know what to eat. So I really like to personalize nutrition, look at people's genetics, look at your food sensitivities, look at your wheat zoomer, vibrant wellness, look at how food makes you feel. Does your pulse go up? How's your heart rate variability after you eat certain foods? Test and not guess with Keto Mojo, the Bio Coach, BioSense, Levels, all these different tools we have out there to really help fine tune what our unique body needs. Our microbiome is all different. Our food sensitivities are different. What foods do best in what macronutrient ratio, and our stress levels and our exercise schedule and how our sleep was. And there's so much to go into it. So there is not one size fits all, but we do all agree nutrient dense whole foods, get rid of the processed foods, get rid of the refined sugars, get rid of the vegetable oils, and really do your best to eat nature's foods. Now, Chris has a lot of information because he is a health researcher. He's a writer, educator, focusing on the impact of low carb and keto diets on health and human performance. He has a master's degree in exercise and nutritional science and has spent his time in graduate school studying and conducting ketogenic research. This is the difference of me being in school how many years ago and kids in school nowadays. I always feel like I'm 35, not 50, but when I read this, I feel really old. Chris is a creator of the brand The Ketologist, which is known for producing social media infographics and educational health content. Chris is the author of Keto Answers, Mommy, Do I Have to Eat This? And educational manager at Perfect Keto. And I know he works with BioCoach as well. So Chris is so fun to talk to, and I love getting opinions of what is metabolic flexibility look like for an athlete. And let's tailor, as I say every episode, all this information we're hearing about for the endurance athlete. We're exercising, we're active, we're moving more than once a day. I work out in the morning and then I have to do something at lunchtime, and I try to do yoga or walk at nighttime, or I go to the gym and lift weights without doing high heart rate stuff because it messes up my sleep. And we also need to track our recovery, our repair, looking at your aura or your Whoop score, and really taking care of yourself. So I will stop talking because I know I've been talking a lot in the episode. So you can tell me if you want to hear more from me or less. I don't care. I won't be too offended. I will bring on Chris, and then I'm actually going to be on his show coming up this fall. So it'll be fun. Share information. So let's hear what the ketologist has to say about the low carb athlete. Hey, fellow endurance athletes. I am going to talk shop again with a fun new guest, Chris Irvine, the ketologist. We're going to talk nutrition, mapping out your cycle with nutrition and your exercise a little bit, and more on metabolic efficiency, keto flex, so metabolic flexibility, all these things that we are curious about and we hear about on other blogs, podcasts, and social media. But what I'm trying to do is bring in all this information that we hear about, read about, and hear other people's success stories, but how to personalize it for you, how to dial in all this information and realize that it's an N=1 experiment. It's your journey. And it's going to be different for everybody. So what works for me isn't going to work the same for you. And most of these people that you hear online, they're not talking to the endurance athlete, a triathlete that might be working out like me some days. As today, I went for an hour, 10-minute bike ride. I'm swimming masters at lunch. And tonight I have track workout at 6 p.m. Tomorrow will be easy day. And yesterday was easy day. So I need to change what I'm eating each day, change my calories, though I don't count calories, but looking at your macros and changing around everything based on your energy output. So a new word I like to talk about too is called energy flux. So Chris is in my waiting room. So I'm going to pause and bring him in, and we'll dive into all these questions that we have. I've got Chris finally on the show to talk shop today about the low carb athlete, fueling and training to perform our best in life. And of course, my goal is always to improve my future self. The aging process, longevity should be really important, I would think, than what my events and races are this year. So thanks, Chris, coming on the show to talk about nutrition and everything else for our audience.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited about this podcast in particular. I do a lot of podcasts, but I don't always get to come on athlete focused podcasts. And I was a college athlete, and I'm a big fan of it. So I think it's cool to normally whenever I'm on a podcast and we're talking about keto, I always have to make these caveats of like, if you're an athlete, it's a little different and all this stuff. So I'm excited we get to focus on that population of people.
Thank you. That's what feel like my purpose is this whole season this year is to be more specific, because I've had the show for 10 years and we've talked about all this, but I think we have a newer audience because of, people like you and Dr. Mindy and Ben Azadi and Cynthia Thurlow and Dr. Anna, all these people that are friends of mine now, but no one's talking about this information for the athlete doing, like I just said, one or more workouts a day, and what type of workout. And Dr. Gabrielle Leon, I love her information about protein, and work with Ben Greenfield, learning where to place those carbs. So I think it comes down to it's so personalized, and the information out there might not be the ideal nutrition plan for you as someone that's exercising a lot more than the typical person.
Totally. Yeah. I was just talking about this a little bit this morning, how, we really have to look at, I think, all areas of health, but especially nutrition. As you hear it all the time, like personalized, 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 but it really is, it's so important because, I think even within personalization, you have to consider goals, right? And like, what are the priority of your goals? And for an athlete, the priority of your health goals are a little bit different than somebody who, say, is just trying to lose weight or, manage a chronic disease or something like that, which is usually what I'm always talking about is, chronic disease and losing weight. But it's a much different thing. And I think that kind of leads to a different approach to nutrition, even within the context of low carb and keto dieting. Like, I think a lot of times we get hung up on the idea that like low carb keto dieting is done a certain way. It's like one way of doing it, but that's really not the case. There's a lot of kind of wiggle room within a low carb keto diet. There's a lot of different strategies you can implement to, tailor it to whatever your goals are. So, I think it's really important for athletes to understand that like it's a little bit different for them versus, the general population.
So good question there. How would you describe what keto is, and is it ideal for an endurance athlete?
Yeah, for sure. So, I like to kind of lean on the explanation of keto being more of a metabolic state of ketosis rather than it being a specific diet. I think that at its core, the goal of keto is that you're trying to get into a state of elevated ketones and then, at least kind of well-rounded managed blood sugar levels. And then, the degree of ketosis that you're trying to get into is, again, a little bit dependent on the goal. So for somebody who is, trying to follow a ketogenic diet for brain cancer, for instance, or epilepsy, you're probably talking about a greater degree of ketosis, which is going to be a different dietary strategy that's going to get you there versus maybe an athlete who's trying to maintain just enough of a level of ketosis to stay insulin sensitive, metabolically flexible, and kind of gain some of those performance benefits from keto. So I like to look at a little bit more of that. If you are keto is you having elevated blood ketones, and that can be as little as 0.3 millimolars or as high as, 4 or 5 millimolars, depending on what you're going for.
Do you think it is beneficial for someone to be in nutritional ketosis while they are exercising to improve performance? If the goal is to burn fat, if we want to be fat burning for endurance sports, is it necessary to show ketones if I stopped and took a blood test?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it, again, a little bit depends on, where that goal falls. So if you're somebody who, say you're exercising, you're an athlete, but you're kind of just like you're an everyday, just like to get like, me at this stage, I play a lot of basketball, but it's not, optimizing for basketball performance is not maybe my priority goal. Mm-hmm. I have other health goals. So, I think that answer is a little bit different. Now, if somebody's main goal is burning fat and losing weight, then performance is kind of coming second, then I think being in a state of ketosis while you're actually training is incredibly important. But if you're somebody whose primary goal is that athletic performance and performing at a high level, then, being at a really deep state of ketosis may not really be all that beneficial. And I think for athletes specifically, there's also a difference between training and competing. I think that's mm-hmm. worth considering. So, I think somebody who is, if you're training, I think generally training in a lower carb state, where you are, elevated ketones, you're primarily relying on fat and ketones, I think is really important. But when it comes to competition where, the goal is shifting a little bit more towards, having if it's an endurance sport, knocking some seconds off of your time. If it's a, strength sport, being able to be a little bit stronger, then, being in ketosis may not be the most important. Maybe you can kind of take this dual fuel approach of, having some carbohydrates, and then allowing your body to burn through those carbohydrates and transition into a state of ketosis. So I wouldn't be looking in an athlete for, like, if I were to kind of measure if their nutritional strategy was optimal for them, I wouldn't be testing their blood ketones and saying like, oh, yeah, that ketone reading is telling me that it's optimal. I'd be looking more towards things like, how do you feel when you're training? How is your performance? What are your numbers? And then figuring out what kind of the strategies that you're following there and how we can optimize that. So I think ketones are important, especially as you kind of relate to endurance and ultra endurance mm-hmm. Athletes, because you're talking about, is it better to have a gel pack of sugar and carbohydrates every 30 minutes, or is it better to be able to kind of go long periods of time without eating and still being able to generate your own energy? So, in those cases, a greater degree of ketosis could be a little bit more important than, say, somebody who is, doing like a 5K or something like that, right? Where, Being at zero point 0.5 or 1.0 millimolar is probably not going to offer a whole lot of additional benefit for performance versus being at 0.3 to 0.5.
So we're talking about having that metabolic flexibility. So you're having that dual fuel when you're, say, doing like a hard workout that you're burning carbs, but you're able to burn fat as your main fuel source and have that backup fuel tank as carbohydrates for that rocket fuel. So when I am doing a race, like say a half marathon, I can pick it up the last few miles and surge, or doing a 5K race where you're going to be anaerobic the entire time. And then afterwards, maybe a couple hours later, you'll see yourself switch back into fat burning. So we have to have that flexibility to go back and forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think it's the best of both worlds, really, because if you look at, an athlete who is, I grew up, I was a baseball player and, I ran cross country too, but in college, playing basketball is my main sport. And, I remember just being told, you got to carb load, you got to carb load, you got to carb load. And same thing in high school when I was running cross country, you always have to, load up on carbohydrates. And it's such a one-sided approach to it of, that can be great, but what happens when you burn through those carbohydrates? Mm-hmm. The thing is you have, it's, you have to load up on the carbs before you train or before you compete, which it can cause a lot of issues like feeling sluggish, having GI distress, having to go to the bathroom during your workout or during your performance. So that's not great. And then there's the side of, once you burn through those during your performance, what happens? And for many people, it's either crashing and seeing a big dip in their performance, or them having to load up on, another form of sugar, carbohydrates, which again introduces the opportunity for, GI distress, having to go to the bathroom, all these other things. So when you look at the dual fuel approach, what's best about it is that, for one, that carbohydrate tank is a lot smaller than our fat tank. I think this is something that everybody talks a lot about now, but you're talking about only being able to store 2,000 to 3,000 calories in the form of carbohydrates versus, even in the leanest of athletes, 25,000 plus calories as fat. So, I think logically speaking, we can say it would make a lot more sense to have this reserve tank, this thing that we can tap into that is effectively endless, that will make it so our bodies don't have to, rely on breaking down muscle or rely on, having to ingest something to maintain our performance. So, the dual fuel, I think, really comes into play, and it's a difficult thing to get to. And I'll say, relating it to not necessarily endurance athletes, but athletes as a whole. I do a nutrition camp for it's an NFL combine camp. So I work with a lot of different NFL players, and, the dual fuel approach, I think, is important for them too. Like it's, over the course of a game, it's many hours. Even though their exercise is a little bit more short burst, it's really beneficial for them to be able to tap into an additional fuel source during a game. And for the position players like the receivers and the running backs, these guys are, really metabolically healthy. They're very lean, sitting around 5, 6, 7% body fat. They can, their bodies very easily make that transition. But when you start looking at, the offensive linemen who, by the nature of their position, have to carry more weight, they're a lot, their body fat percentage is a lot higher. They tend to be a lot more insulin resistant. They don't really have this capability. So, kind of as a double factored approach for them, they load up on carbohydrates, and one, they're insulin resistant. So they're not really even able to utilize them as effectively as they could versus their, more skilled position counterparts. But then also, once they do burn through what they can use, their body is not primed and in a position to be able to tap into, they have plenty of body fat that they could use, but their body's really not primed to be able to do so. So it's kind of this like wasted energy reserve that they can't really tap into. So the ability, something that takes effort and it takes work to get to the point of being able to do both. Like our bodies, especially in the context of the standard American diet, our bodies just don't naturally transition from burning carbs to fat like maybe they would have for our ancestors who are eating a more primal diet. So I think it is one of the most important factors for all sports, not just endurance sports, but especially when you start getting into endurance sports. I think that's where it makes, even more of a difference.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was just thinking of too, the HVMN IQ, the ketone IQ bottles. I've been testing them out on a long bike ride because it's more getting that dual fuel. If you are, still burning fat, but maybe you're starting to get hungry. So I'm going over their protocols next month, but just testing it out myself if I need more brain focus and having a hard bike race or bike ride that you start to get tired, and then see if that really impacts my ability to ride, because riding is, running, you can just kind of go and walk, run if you need to, but biking, you're not to fall off your bike and going down hills, you have to navigate and technical skills. So I think that's just interesting experiment to do, as well as they say to help recovery as well afterwards. So
yeah, that's a good point that for sure. Yeah. I mean, I actually just took a shot at Ketone IQ before we did this podcast. So I'm a big fan of that product as well. But I think that's an underappreciated component of athletics, is the mental component of it. So, and that's important as it relates to ketones too, because ketones aren't just a performance fuel. They're also a mental fuel. We know that our brain will take up ketones in proportion to their availability in our blood. So increasing our ketones effectively increases the energy that is supplied to our brain. And even more interestingly is that a lot of our, even our muscles will have a tendency to reserve ketones and not metabolize them to preserve them for the brain, because it's so great for the brain to have them. So that's kind of this, and what is, maybe it's not as quantifiable, but what is the benefit of feeling good when you're training? What is the benefit to, not having, not being tired, to not having, brain fog, all of these things that having elevated ketones can provide. And that is something where I think the exogenous ketones, and especially the ketone esters like HVMN has, is so interesting, because you're able to increase your ketone levels to a degree that would be pretty hard to do naturally. For you to get to 2.5, 3.0 blood ketone level naturally, you're talking about probably doing a pretty long fast. You're talking about being, pretty calorie and carbohydrate restricted for a long period of time. Generally speaking, for most people, that's what it would take to get there. And that might not be what's most advantageous for the athlete, right? Like to go into a, 50-mile run, not having 8 for 72 hours and just that's probably going to be something that's going to harm performance. So something like HVMN is really interesting, because you're able to give yourself kind of this, I'm hesitant to say artificial because that sounds bad, but this kind of exogenous, this exogenous source that can boost, and that may be something that, again, if you talk about how the brain has kind of the preferential utilization of ketones, like they're going to kind of get the first dibs on it. If you're only able to get your ketones up to say 0.5 naturally while you're training, how much of those ketones are going to be left for your muscles and the rest of your body to use versus your brain eating them all up. Whereas, if you're taking something that's spiking it up to a greater degree, now are we talking about having, some fuel both for the brain and for our muscles, which it would be ideal for the athlete. So what HVMN is doing is really exciting. And, I've been studying exogenous ketones since I was in grad school. I was working in a lab where we were looking at the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones in athletes. So we were looking at, what did we have? We had soccer players, we had baseball players, basketball players, all kinds of different athletes. And it's really come a long way. Back then you couldn't even, the worst part was even getting them to be able to drink them. The palatability of them was so bad that it was like no college athlete was ever going to be able to drink this drink. And now I do kind of hear some complaints every once in a while on the taste of HVMN, but I always tell people, I'm like, if you saw where these things came from and what they used to taste like, you'd be happy that they taste the way they do now.
Yeah, so true. Well, it's funny because I have a friend that is in town and doing this 600K bike ride next weekend.
Wow.
In Encinitas. It's 3 different loops of 120 miles, and they have to do it in 40 hours. So that is like an ultra adventure race, almost just on the bike, but they have to go overnight too. So she's from Kona, Ingrid. She's going to listen to this, I'm sure. And she took one of my Ketone IQ bottles because I handed them out at our podcast party on Saturday. And she tried it on her test ride. And she's like, this really made a difference, my clarity and focus and the brain fog. So I think it's, interesting. And I have a client in Australia I was coaching that she's doing adventure racing, like the 3-day events, and doing low carb, high fat, protein, and just, how important these might be for that type of sport, to take a shot of these in the middle when you're struggling and you don't get to sleep. I know they're doing some tests on, I think Navy SEALs is what Lat said they're doing research on, but it's just fascinating to look at performance for athletes doing these ultra events that are especially overnight.
Yeah, true. It's so true. And like, and that's kind of the extreme end, right? Like you're talking like less than 1% of people that are able to do that. And that's, that's where something like that's required, right? Like this is the Ketone IQ product is a very, there's a lot of research behind it. There's a lot of thought put into its formulation. It's a pretty, intricate product that like that population, it's no surprise that they could benefit from something like that. But even, scaling it down, there's a lot of, for me, I remember the first time I took it, again, I play a lot of basketball, and basketball is kind of this weird in between sport where there's, what's that?
I've heard you say this in podcasts, how it would just help your like make more shots and focus.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the endurance component of it was insane because, basketball it's endurance, but it's sprinting. It's kind of like a high intensity interval training in a way. And, I remember the first time I took it, I thought, I was out there and there was like a possession where there was no dead ball for a while. So I'd sprinted, 3 or 4 down and backs in a row, where normally once a dead ball hits, I'd kind of, even being in good shape, I'd have my hands on my knees, I'd be breathing heavy. And I remember just like standing straight up and being like, man, I feel good. And, I'm pretty skeptical of any supplement. So I didn't think of that. When I took it before that day, I wasn't anticipating it really doing much for me. And so I was like, man, I'm getting in really good shape. This is great. Like I must be, really, making some good adaptations here. And then on the way home from the gym, it kind of dawned on me. I was like, oh, I took Ketone IQ before I played today. And so it does make a noticeable, it's one of the few things that I've taken outside of caffeine that I've actually noticed a big benefit from, like caffeine is, like most pre-workouts that people take, even the most, well-formulated ones, most of the benefit that you're getting is from caffeine, right? Like that's kind of what's really moving the needle. There's a few other interesting ingredients, I think, like, beta alanine and citrulline malate that can be good for certain use cases in sports, but really, the 80-20, you're getting most of it from caffeine. If you were to strip all the ingredients out and just drink a cup of coffee, you'd probably feel just as good. But, the key with the HVMN Ketone IQ, that was one of the first things I took that I was like, wow, this is actually, and even kind of comparable to caffeine in the boost that you get. So, we don't have to go on forever about it, but it is such an interesting product as it relates to athletes.
Well, I was just thinking of, talking about pre-workouts. I know Sean Wells had a few weeks ago, just a pre-workout suggestions. I'm like, dude, that's like 10 different supplements I have to put in my body or in a drink. I rather just keep it simple, just have like one scoop of something or take a shot of something. But I don't know if he's going to formulate that all together, but it's like, that's a lot of stuff to take.
Yeah. Well, you see it so much on the market now. Like you look at, and a lot of them are marketed to athletes, right? Like whether it's a pre-workout or, something to take, during your workout and stuff like that. And it's like most of it, I don't think you should discredit the placebo effect, because placebo effect does work, in a lot of cases. So there are some times where you'll take something and you think you're going to feel good and you feel good and you end up performing better because of it. So, I wouldn't fully discredit that part of it, but generally speaking, you're not, a lot of these things aren't moving the needle as much as what you think they are. Now, sometimes when you're talking about, you're in the 1%, you're a professional athlete, you're in the 1%, and moving the needle just this much could be the difference between breaking a world record or, getting an actual starting spot or a job in whatever the position is that you're in. Like that is maybe a little bit different story, but for most of us, moving the needle this much probably isn't worth even the financial investment that it would be required to take a lot of those different supplements. So that's something I've definitely changed like when I was in college and I was an athlete, I remember I took everything, if there's anything that somebody said could boost my performance, I'm on it, looking up the research on it, like, oh, that's an awesome study. Like didn't realize at the time it was a rat study, but that's okay. Like there's a study saying
we're
it's
just
good
like
for
rats.
Yeah. Right. So I've changed my stance on that a lot now, where I think it's much better to get our bodies in a position where they can handle the load that we put on them when we're doing an athletic feat.
So kind of goes into another question. Fasted exercise, you mentioned, getting in a nutritional ketosis, higher level, like 3 to 5 ketones before we're going to work out. I think it's a big area of, I'm seeing people probably causing too much stress. So if we look at this new word, I love looking into energy flux and having more for athletes. I think we just have such a high energy output and we're not getting enough energy in because, and I did this, and this is why I keep talking about this. I think I was doing so much fasting because you're not hungry when you're fat adapted. You're eating that protein and fat, you're full, and you have like, oh, I'm going to do 1 meal a day. And I would work out 3 times a day or twice a day, or be moving all the time because I was in fitness. And I think, it's listening to all that information, as I said earlier, and like, okay, But what about us, the endurance athletes, and what about us female athletes that have hormones? We're totally causing imbalance and dysfunction. So with exercise and doing keto, what have you found in your research and discussing with people and athletes with not eating extended period of time, then exercising, and when is it appropriate to break a fast and eat more food, still burning fat? And then the third part would be discuss like, are all carbs evil? As we talk about like, oh, now it's like, oh, I can't do any carbs, but when to throw them in, when is it actually beneficial?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, it depends. My always take on the fasted exercise is that you should do what makes you feel best. Like when you go into the gym, whether it's, whatever the type of exercise that you're doing is, like you need to feel good and you need to perform at a high level. So for some people, I do think there's some people who generally feel good going in fasted. Like I know when I lift weights in the morning, I go pretty early in the morning, but I feel a lot better just going in fasted and doing it. But if I'm playing basketball, I like to have some fruit before I perform. So I think it's like whatever makes you feel best, that's going to be the telltale sign. Because if you look at the research around like fat burning and things like that for fasted versus fed exercise, there's not a huge difference as it relates to over the course of the whole day. So like, yeah, you might burn a little bit more fat during the exercise if you're fasted, but over the course of the whole day, it kind of ends up being a washout in most cases. Now, some of that can change a bit depending on what your diet looks like, during your feeding window. But generally speaking, I don't think there's enough of a difference to warrant, performing in a perceived deficit, like not feeling well because, you might be burning more fat or anything like that. So I think that's kind of the first thing. And then, as it relates to like athletes and women, especially, we have to look at what comes with fasting. And so, fasting isn't just not eating for a period of time and then everything else is the same. Fasted also leads to a general overall calorie deficit. And then, which is typically accompanied with a protein deficit. And, if you look at, there was a study published a couple of years ago that was looking at men and women, and these weren't athletes. These were just kind of like your everyday average Joes that were following like a keto diet and they were resistance training. They were in a calorie deficit and they were consuming, I think it was like around 20%. They were kind of following that standard keto protocol of like 20% of their calories from protein. And these people lost muscle. And we're talking about people who are just, like I said, kind of your average Joes, definitely not training at the same intensity as an athlete is going to be training. Definitely not training the same amount of hours that an athlete's going to be training. And definitely not as dependent on having muscle mass as what an athlete is. So, an athlete knows like you can't sacrifice muscle mass. I mean, it's a very important thing to hold on to. It's what it determines our ability to, not only perform, but also being able to metabolize nutrients is all dependent on having, quality muscle. So that's kind of my biggest concern with it. I think that if you're doing as an athlete, if you're doing fasted exercise and that's leading to a low protein intake over the course of the day and a calorie deficit that isn't warranted, like I know there are parts of an athlete's season where a calorie deficit is beneficial, but it's not the whole season. So if it's leading to this calorie deficit that's going to harm, both performance and recovery from performance, then I don't think that that's going to be a good strategy. So, my advice to athletes would be, if you feel good fasted when you exercise, then do it, but know that there's going to be some things on the back end that you're going to have to take into account, like where are your calories and where are your protein and what are the actual types of food that you're eating during your feeding window. And if you're somebody who you feel like trash when you exercise in a fasted state, well, the one thing is if you do feel like trash, it might be because you are insulin resistant. So that would kind of be the first thing to look into. But if you're not, and you just generally just don't feel like you're performing at a high level fasted, then I don't think it's worth it to consider that.
Well, that's what I've been saying a lot lately is that, all right, maybe my run workout's my test because I've gotten to be super slow compared to my old self. And I'm like, well, maybe I could use a little bit more calories before my long run and maybe try that out because we get I would say, we're AAA determined, ambitious, hardcore athletes that was like, oh, everyone says fasted exercise. I can't break that fast. I'm not going to have anything. Carbs are evil. I'm not going to do this or that, but realize, okay, my performance sucks. So why do I keep doing this if I'm not getting faster? So I think that's when you have to go look at the big picture, get maybe a coach to help you assess and course correct and maybe experiment. Like you said, having some berries beforehand, having Vespa has a little carbs in it from bee pollen. It has a little orange juice in it, and have a little shot of that, or have something. But I think it's so hard because we're so, like, if you've been in this area a long time, you're so stuck on being keto and not think that I want to improve my performance and longevity, that all we get kind of brainwashed that it's all or nothing. And I think that's a hard part for people that are listening and following the keto trends and trying, we have this Facebook group page, Stephanie Holbrook started Keto Endurance. And these, I keep hearing these same questions of, fear of having any carbohydrates. And then you hear the carnivore people like Paul Saladino that says everything is bad for you, but nose to tail and berries. So it's like,
right.
What do we do for an athlete? And then, test it out yourself and notice, am I going faster? It might be better then for you. So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think, and this kind of goes along the lines of your question of like, are carbs evil? I think that also has to be considered within the context of the individual. So, if you are insulin, what type? Well, so there's the what type question too, but there's also, where is your metabolic health? So if you're insulin resistant and metabolically damaged, then generally speaking, most carbohydrates aren't going to be great for you because you're just going to be spiking glucose, secreting insulin and kind of further contributing to that problem. So, I think that's kind of the first thing, but that doesn't, if that is where you're at, that's not your fate. Like you can, through doing low carbohydrate diets and fasting and things like that, you can restore some degree of that metabolic flexibility and insulin sensitivity where that's not the case. And then once you get to that point, then it starts becoming about, okay, so now maybe carbohydrates can be beneficial for me, but what types of carbohydrates? And even that I think is a little bit personalized. I know, some people will love to have, some starchy carbohydrates before they perform, where other people like to have more like fruit and stuff like that. Like I know for me, I prefer fruit if I'm going to have a carbohydrate beforehand. But the type is really important because, everybody, I think, especially with the calorie movement, everybody gets kind of so hung up on like a calorie is a calorie, but we have to be honest and know that there's a massive difference between, 10 grams of sugar from blueberries and 10 grams of sugar from, Oreos. Like that is two completely different things. And what they're going to do for our bodies are going to be drastically different. So, I think that question of like, are carbohydrates evil? And, should I never have a carbohydrate again? I think for the question of should I never have a carbohydrate again, I think that's, that's a no for everybody. I don't think anybody needs to be to that point, but if they're evil really depends on where you're at. And which is an important thing to assess. A lot of people don't know that because I think a lot of times we assume that, if you're lean, that means you're insulin sensitive. Well, that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of athletes out there who are sitting around 10, 12% body fat. And in comparison to the rest of the population, they look very healthy. But if you were to look at their metabolic profiles, they're very metabolically damaged and in some cases even hovering along the lines of being pre-diabetic. So for those people, even though it looks like they would be the perfect candidate for, consuming carbohydrates before exercise, probably not the case for them either. So it's an important thing to figure out. And it also highlights, I think, the fact that even for whether you're an athlete or not an athlete, there's a journey component of this, right? This isn't like a jump in and follow a certain way of dieting and eat that way forever. For an athlete listening to this, your journey might look like, getting insulin sensitive, making sure that you can utilize carbohydrates, getting your body in a position where it can take a dual fuel approach, training in a lower carb state to make, these adaptations that are going to be beneficial, and then going and competing in a state where you are, utilizing carbohydrates that your body responds well to, which I think is important too. So, it depends is never a popular answer amongst most people, but I think it's in a lot of cases, it's the right answer.
Yeah. So true. And I think it's looking at what I keep trying to clarify, especially on the show being called Low Carb Athlete, is I tried calling it the whole athlete for a while and that it got taken from us. But the low carb athlete doesn't mean zero carb. It could be 100 to 300 grams of carbs, but it is the goal to balance your blood sugar and to be burning fat and be metabolically flexible. So you have that ability to switch to carbs when you need to and switch back to fat. But that's that process you're talking about, being fat adapted, getting metabolically healthy. Because I get a lot of clients that are athletes that are insulin resistant and on their way, if not already, to type 2 diabetes. So we have to work on addressing that. And that could be related to chronic stress. I mean, there's so many different areas because I became insulin resistant from my adrenal exhaustion. And it was more like, I'm eating low carb. And I always tell people that story that I wrote in my book that I was doing fasted exercise. I was doing low carb, high fat, and I still became insulin resistant. It had nothing to do with what I was eating. It was what I was doing nonstop in life.
Right.
So I think that's an important part is the chronic stress. But with people just trying to figure out their nutrition and timing it with their exercise, I think is an important part. And, knowing nature's carbs is what I was getting to, is that eating real food doesn't mean I'm going to have a bagel for my carb load. And like you're saying, having some berries. Now, do you match those berries with some heavy cream or coconut cream or something, or you just have berries by itself? Do you try to balance your blood sugar with what you
I haven't really experienced. Now, if outside of athletic performance, so if I'm, eating a meal that has carbohydrates in it and I'm not exercising around that time, then I'll usually take some strategies to try to balance it out. Like, either having something with some fat and fiber in it, or eating fat and protein first, and then having if I'm breakfast, for instance, like I'm going to eat my eggs before I'm going to have, maybe some of the blueberries, just out of the goal of trying to reduce the blood sugar spike. But going into a performance, like if I'm going to play basketball or going for a run, I don't mind the blood sugar spike, because the way that I kind of look at it a different way of like, I actually want to use that up front to kind of get me going. And then I want to be able to kind of burn through that and then settle into the fat burning that comes, after that. So I don't, and we also do know too that like a workout to some degree is going to blunt some of the insulin and glucose response from that carbohydrate it's not going to get as high as what it would have if you weren't exercising. But I really don't worry about that as much. Like I find that I generally will perform better on more of an empty stomach than a full stomach. So to follow up, any of those carbohydrates with a lot of fat doesn't really work that well for me. But I've also heard stories from some people where if they consume something that spikes their blood sugar too much, and then they start to get a crash afterwards, they can start getting kind of that shakiness that is not ideal for performance. So I think it's one of those things where experimenting is really, really important. Like if you're somebody who hasn't consumed carbohydrates before a workout, or before a training, you wouldn't want to go into like this big race you have coming up and then just like load up on carbs and hope it goes well, right? You would want to make sure that you've tested a little bit of the timing of the carbohydrates and the type of carbohydrates and the amount that you're consuming, and if you should consume it with other things. So for me, I haven't noticed or I haven't felt the need to complement it with anything. But outside of athletics and within my day to day, I definitely will always take strategies to kind of reduce the blood sugar spike that a carbohydrate may cause.
So you want to train to be metabolic fat adapted, then train to be metabolically flexible, and have like what Dan Feldman's trying to stress out in his, I don't know if you listen to him about energy metabolism, that we need to look at like, all right, if I have problems digesting carbs, it's more what is broken in your metabolism that you're having issues, and maybe why is your blood sugar going so high? So it's more looking at what else is going on that could be indicator of carb metabolism problems, versus always just thinking of fat metabolism is all I need to do. But it's looking at the why, what's broken.
Well, it's really, that is one of the most important parts, because without proper carbohydrate metabolism, what's the point of even consuming them, right? Like it's funny, like in the fitness industry, especially, you see, it's like, oh, just have a bunch of Pop-Tarts before I work out, or have a bowl of cereal before I work out. And it's like, well, one, that's not a great source of carbohydrates to begin with, but what is the effect of that over time? If you're getting this massive blood sugar spike, that is a lot more than what you're going to get naturally, right? That's a big thing too. Like you said, nature's carbs, the blood sugar spike you're going to get from having blueberries is not the same thing that you're going to get from having a bowl of cereal. And it's that blood sugar spike that you get from the bowl of cereal that chronically over time is going to kind of cause this level of insulin resistance that's going to make it so you no longer efficiently use those carbs. So it's always so funny, because these people are so hung up on like, oh, I have to, eat these things and boost my performance, and I'll replenish glycogen afterwards. But then you look at, their metabolic health, and it's like none of those things, they're not happening to the degree that you think they're happening, because your body is not primed to be able to do that. So it really is the most, like, I think whenever I'm working with an athlete, that's always my first thing is let's test your blood sugar, let's test your insulin, and let's test your A1C, and let's just see where you're at to figure out, if you should be eating carbohydrates. Because if all of those numbers are coming back high, then we're not there. And our goal should be, let's find a period in your off season, most likely, where we can double down on our efforts to restore that metabolic health so that you can actually start to utilize those later. But if it's a matter of just wanting to, consume a ton of carbohydrates for the sake of consuming them, I don't think that's going to be a great approach for most athletes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's funny because I think it's looking at, your name is the ketologist. Can't say the word, but you're not saying to be strict ketosis all the time, nutritional ketosis, even though you're the keto research guy and talk about keto and your name's keto. Are you saying more cyclical keto? Or, I don't even like the word keto, but, just eat real food, balance your blood sugar, burn fat, and be able to burn carbs as backup fuel tank. But what's your take of, cyclical keto? What do you want people to do that are not metabolically damaged, that are athletes? What's your viewpoint on that you already kind of mentioned, but kind of put that
I think it is a big disclaimer, and it's kind of probably been a bane to my existence, is this kind of assumption that I think keto is, because there are a lot of zealots out there that feel this way. So it's, a lot of people think that I think that keto's all or nothing, and everybody should do it, and you should do it all the time, and all these different things. And that's not how I feel at all. I think, I think the goal for the healthy person who has achieved optimal health is that you're operating in some degree of ketosis all the time. That doesn't mean not eating carbohydrates. Like for me, because I've worked so hard to restore my metabolic health, even consuming around 100 grams of carbohydrates a day, which I don't do that all the time, but let's say on a day that I consume 100 grams of carbohydrates, I'm still operating in some degree of ketosis, whether it's 0.1 or 0.2 millimolars. So I think that the goal is to get to a point where everybody is producing them to some degree and metabolizing them. And during a fast, even just an overnight fast, you're waking up with elevated ketone levels, because that is a sign of good metabolic health. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of when I look at, as the ketologist and somebody that is promoting ketosis, it's like everybody should be able to very easily get into a state of ketosis. If you don't eat for 2 or 3 hours, you shouldn't get hangry and have to go run to the first little, food that you find and consume it. You should be able to go 2 or 3 hours without eating, no problem. And because the fact that you are able to kind of transition into this state of ketosis. So that's kind of where I think the end goal is for everybody to get to. But then where keto, as it is the diet and being in a deep state of ketosis and all of that comes in, is when you're not there. And that's when it's really important. Like when you look at, outside of athletics, you look at our general population where, the stat is 89% are metabolically damaged. Well, what that means is that 89% of people probably don't metabolize carbohydrates very well right now. So for them, a lower carb diet that's focused more on keeping blood sugar in check and strategies to increase ketone levels, that's going to be what's most optimal for them. So for those people, that is what I'm going to be recommending across the board. But the goal isn't to get in ketosis and stay in ketosis forever and that you never have a carbohydrate ever again. It's, using that strategy to get yourself over here to the point where you're still able to maintain that low level of ketosis despite consuming some carbohydrates, and you don't get hungry, every 2 or 3 hours and things like that. So it's a little bit different from what I think more of the extreme approaches to keto and what a lot of people are kind of thinking of when they hear keto. Mine is, I don't think anybody is, outside of certain therapeutic uses, I don't think it's required for anybody to have to maintain a deep state of ketosis or following a ketogenic diet long term. I think for many, it's just using it as a restorative tool to get them to a better place metabolically.
Yeah, I think the word tool is what I would say too. It's a tool to improve your metabolic health. But yeah. So would you ever test, I've been testing with Biosense experimenting. It's kind of like Lumen, like Keto Mojo, ketone glucose, or CGM as Nutrisensor levels. Are you testing that with people or yourself? And then part 2 would be, all right, overnight, I wake up and the ketone level isn't super high. You think you are burning fat all night, but that to me is indication of what's internal stressors while you're sleeping. And looking at heart rate variability and, liver time is 1 to 2 a.m. And if you're not sleeping through the night, that, okay, there's maybe some parasites in there causing some internal stress. So if you wake up and your ketones are low, what do you look at that? So testing, and then how we use that information to figure out a personalized program for people.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I do think testing is really important. And I think testing blood sugar is a really good marker to follow. It'll give you a pretty good picture of where you're at currently, and tracking it over time will tell you not only the state of your metabolic health, but also your response to different foods and which foods are maybe more or less optimal for you. But even more important than glucose, I think, is testing insulin. Insulin is kind of this, which it's a kind of taboo because it's a little bit harder to test. But
that's what I'm laughing about. Sorry to interrupt, but I've been trying to get blood tested from a new doctor, and my dad just passed away in the hospital in June, and I could not, they didn't even know what insulin was. I want his insulin tested. Like, what? He's not diabetic. He doesn't need insulin. No, the blood marker. But doctors do not test insulin. They don't, it's so hard to get, unless you go Ulta Labs or Direct Labs or something, order it. But go ahead. Sorry. It's just a joke how hard it is when it's so, all the research, everyone, Dr. Ben Bickman and other people are saying.
No, it's such a, I'm glad you highlighted that, because that really is the biggest problem, is that our medical industry has it a little bit backwards. The typical approach now is that we test blood sugar up into a certain point. And then, I hear all the time from folks is like, I went into the doctor and they said, your blood sugar is getting high, but it's not that bad yet. And then, they go in the next time and they say, it's getting a little bit higher, but you're still within the range. And then they go in one day and they say, blood sugar is really high. You might be pre-diabetic or diabetic. We should test your insulin. And then they test their insulin and it's, through the roof. And what people don't realize is that, insulin, and it makes sense if you think about what insulin does, but insulin can be elevated for, Dr. Bickman, as you mentioned, he points this out, is that it can be elevated for up to 10 years before you start seeing impaired glucose levels. And which is, when you think about what insulin does, it makes sense, right? Like if you're constantly spiking your glucose, insulin gets secreted, insulin acts to lower your blood sugar. So as long as, like, for at least some period of time, insulin is going to be doing its job well, it's going to keep that blood sugar in a healthy range. But this number is high and it's high and it's high. And then it's not until you get to a point where you hit insulin resistance, where insulin is no longer able to complete its action, that glucose actually starts to spill over and you start having those high blood sugar levels. And by that point, it's not that it's, I'm always hesitant to say too late, because it's never too late until it's actually too late. But it's usually never too late to do something about it. But when you catch it, like when you take that approach, you completely remove the preventative side of medicine or anything else out of it. You've lost that battle already before you started, because you missed the marker that you should have been tracking to, be able to address prevention. So I think that's, like, for anybody starting fasting insulin, I think is the best thing that you can get tested. It's going to be now as it relates to blood sugar, if you test your blood sugar and it's high, it is high. Like that is what it is. And you might already be there. But just because you test your blood sugar and it's within range doesn't mean that you're out of the, that you're out of the deep waters and that everything's good. Like, you still might be dealing with insulin resistance. So I think getting insulin tested is going to be that really big marker. And as you said, a lot of doctors may be resistant to it I've heard a lot of different reasons, from, one, just generally being dogmatic, but all the way over to just insurance companies not, supporting that and not being willing to pick up that claim. So, there's a lot of reasons why a doctor won't do it, but there are things you can go get it done yourself. You can, go pay out of pocket to get it done at like a Quest Diagnostics or LabCorp or any of those things. I know there's a few at-home insulin testing companies that are starting to get more popular. I haven't fully evaluated them to know how effective an at-home test is versus something you get in a lab, but you may just have to be a little bit more proactive about getting your insulin tested. So from there, once you actually get those things, those numbers, I think, really give you an idea of what you need to do. Because if those numbers are high, as you were stating before, there can be a lot of reasons why those numbers are high, right? Like a high fasted or a high glucose number in the morning or a high insulin number in the morning isn't necessarily just mean that your nutrition is trash. It could be cortisol. It could be that you just didn't get any sleep last night. It could have been you testing at the wrong time is also a big thing. It could be, like you said, parasite or any of these. There's so many different factors. But if you see that thing, and this may be one of those, I forget who it is it Teddy Roosevelt or whatever, says that, to the man, or maybe it's Mark Twain, to the man with a hammer, everything's a nail. As a nutrition guy, I tend to always say, most of the time it's going to be nutrition. But if you get a high blood sugar number or high insulin number, take a look at your diet. What's it look like? Be honest with yourself. If your diet's dialed in and it's locked down, then yeah, you probably need to start looking at some of these other things like, other hormones and adrenal fatigue and cortisol and where your calories at and all this different stuff. But if you're looking at your nutrition, you're like, yeah, I go get McDonald's 3 times a week and I keep eating seed oils nonstop and, I'm spiking my blood sugar 12 times a day, then like that's probably where you should address that's where you should, put your focus first and fix that. And then you can kind of start to worry about some of those other things. And that's not to say that those things aren't important. I just think that generally, if your diet is poor, that's going to be what moves the needle a lot more than say, if you hear all these different strategies, it's like, not eating seed oils, I think is going to make a bigger difference on your health markers than looking at your phone before bed, right? Like I think blue light before bed is a bad thing, but I think seed oils are far worse, right? So it's like, I think we have to look at it that way a bit.
Well, that's what I call my coaching program is the holistic method, where I work on their nutrition and exercise, sleep, stress, digestion, gut health, movement, hydration, happiness. And the first part is nutrition. Just focus on, what are you eating now? Let's just observe and learn, and then work on, let's swap this for that. And then do like Dan Plews on the Endure IQ program teaches this is, do a cold keto for a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks, and get your body fat adapted, and then course correct and personalize it. And I think it's just good to just don't do anything yet. Let's just look what you're doing. Just tell me your normal food plan, how you feel, how's your poop, how's your sleep, how's your exercise. And I use a nutritional therapy assessment form called NutriQues, and it has all the charts. So it's a good way to look at, all right, do I have diarrhea? Or am I constipated? I haven't pooped for days. There's so many clues to just work on. What you are eating now, when, why, and how, and are you digesting and breaking your food down properly? So it's always, start north to south, and then work on all those lifestyle habits. And then if you're still not getting results, then that's when like, all right, let's run a Dutch panel. Let's do GI map. Let's look at, the Zoomer, or I just did upgraded formulas, a hair mineral test, and really collect all these clues. So you're getting more data and investigating the whole picture to help put the missing pieces of the puzzle together for that customized program for that person. That's so unique. But I think there's so many factors. Like I said, I was doing all the nutrition and the fasting, but something was still broken, and, experimenting with the biosense to figure out my ketones and where do you want them? Do you want them high or low? And what should you eat? So it's interesting to get that biofeedback, like Oura Ring, and testing things so you can know, okay, something else is going on. I'm trying all this and it's still not working.
Yeah. Well, I think the feedback thing is important. And I work for a company called BioCoach that we do, we have a medical device that tests blood sugar and ketones, and we have an app that does coaching through it and everything. And my belief is that getting that biofeedback, like you said, is really important, because it's a lot of times we don't relate the way that we feel to, like, we don't think of, well, for one, a lot of us don't even realize that we don't feel good. It kind of has become our baseline, where we don't know that, that I have brain fog because I haven't not had brain fog in a long time, or, I don't know that my energy is low because I don't remember what it was ever like to have good energy. Or digestion, right? Like some people have digestive systems have kind of been a little bit off for so long that they forget. So I think it's important, one, to just think more about yourself and your body, and like, a lot of times we don't even pay attention to our symptoms. We just let it become our baseline. Yeah. But then the biofeedback, I think, is really important too, because, you look at things like blood sugar and mood, for instance. It's like that's two things that you wouldn't probably ever relate to each other, but there's something they're very, very intricate. They are very interconnected, those two things. So, when we look at at BioCoach, we'll have in our app, we have a thing where after you test your blood sugar, you can log different other readings, like, mood, for instance, and then it'll allow you to compare those things over time. So you can see, when my blood sugar spikes up to like 150, my mood is usually pretty shit after that. It's usually not very good. But when my blood sugar is staying at like 82 to 85, I notice that I'm in a much better mood and I have more energy and everything like that. So I do love that about getting the biofeedback. Now, I do think, it's easy for, I think it depends where you're at. For the athlete who, again, is trying to optimize for performance, getting as much of that as possible is what matters, because your top goal is performance. Now, for people who maybe athletic performance is like third or fourth down the list, I don't think you have to get too hung up with knowing every single one of your biomarkers. I think it's more about knowing what are the important ones and then checking in on them periodically to make sure that they're trending in the right direction or staying where you want them to be. But for that elite athlete, knowing what your sleep score is could be all the difference between you breaking a record tomorrow and not breaking a record. Or, knowing what your fasting insulin levels are could be huge, or knowing that your body's able to transition from glucose to ketones is going to be a big difference. So again, I think that even that part kind of comes back to, where does performance lie on your kind of hierarchy of goals?
Yeah. And I think that, testing and not gassing is what we always talk about, but also, like you're saying, I think is what I say is intuition, listening to your body, listening to those red flags. Cause I think when I had my adrenal exhaustion, air quotes around that it was like, okay, where did this come from? It didn't just happen March 2013. Now it's almost 10 years ago, but it was just sideswiped me. But obviously it was years before that building up, and I just pushed through it. And that's why I do what I do now, finally, is to help other people avoid going through that, and really figuring out, that's a red flag, what I should listen to my body and back off and reschedule that workout, or I'm going to walk instead of run, or whatever it might be. But learning that there's something going on. I think we're so often in sympathetic dominance that we don't feel what we should feel. And so we got to, work on, heart rate variability testing and doing the breathing exercises and doing the stress management drills. But I think one thing is to learn how to be intuitive. Is hard for people because they are so sympathetic dominant. They don't feel what they feel.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many things to mask the way you feel too, right? Like if you're tired, throw a fifth cup of coffee on for the day, see if that helps. Or, if you are having skin issues, like, I'll just use some sort of like steroid ointment for it, or have a digestive issue, we'll just chalk that up to having,
Band-Aid.
It's just like all these different Band-Aids for it. So then we're really good at that. I have chronic headaches, we'll take Tylenol or whatever. So I think that's why I always love, like, my approach to anything is, if I'm like, for instance, the last month I was traveling a ton. I was, not really in my like normal routine. I wasn't exercising as much as I normally do. My diet wasn't as good as it normally is. I went to like a bachelor party where I was, having a few alcoholic beverages, a lot more than I would normally have. And, I started noticing, like, man, my joints are not feeling good. Like my knees and my ankle joints are like flaring up. It's not good. Because I've kind of trained myself to be this way, my response is never to take anything to fix that. It's like, I need to sit in that to one, be able to recognize that it's a problem, and realize that I don't want to deal with that anymore. Like, I don't want to live every day in knee pain and joint pain. I don't want to, show up to play basketball and like feel like I'm 50 years old, or, not that being 50 is bad, but I'm 30. So I don't want to feel 20 years older than I am.
Yeah.
But that's not like a good thing. So there's something about sitting in our discomforts a little bit, I think, to realize that this isn't where we want to be, because I think that can give us some motivation to say, I'm sick of, I had a buddy of mine at the gym the other day that told me, like, he kind of finally had this eye-opening experience, and he was just like, I'm done feeling this way. I'm done, not feeling good when I exercise, having brain fog, low energy, not having a lot of like confidence in like my body and things like that. He's like, I'm done with it. I'm throwing away all this food out. Like, I'm sick of dealing with this. And sometimes it takes us getting to that point before we're actually willing to make a change. If we mask everything and we find ways to cover it up, then we can go our whole lives and deal with these things. And that's obviously not going to be a good thing long term.
So I started I owned a fitness studio and closed it October 2019 after 10 years, but I was focusing on just doing online health coaching before COVID. And I used to always want to focus on endurance athletes, and I just gave up because they don't want help, because they just are so stubborn and just wait to the very end. It's like, oh my gosh, why don't you start taking care of yourself now and prevent, what happened to me by taking ownership for your health now. And it took me until this year, finally, like, just stop trying to help everyone that feels like crap, chronic stress, disease, and metabolic chaos, and just focus on my people, the endurance athlete, because that's my background and passion. So that was my purpose, that I figured out, like, just stay in my lane, because those are people that I can relate to, and not the people that just don't exercise. But it's such a hard area, because a lot of endurance athletes don't want to invest money in their health and coaching and helping figure out what's wrong, because they rather drop 10 grand on a bike or a set of race wheels, or, new helmet or something. And it's so funny how athletes just don't realize that, okay, I'm actually breaking myself down and speeding up the aging process than improving it. And I keep talking about what Dr. Ben Hardy talks about, training your future self. Like when you're 30, you should be looking at how I want to be living life when I'm 50. 60, 70, 80 years old. And so we should be taking action now to set ourselves up for success later. And I think people forget about that part. And they're just like, I'm just focused on this A race this year.
Totally. Well, it's like, if you love what you're doing and you love whatever sport it is or athletic endeavor that you're doing is, don't you want to be able to do that for as long as possible, and that's, what we're not considering, or, at least being able to maintain it for as long as possible. Like, you don't want to get into your 30s, 40s, and 50s. And, obviously you're going to have, presumably some sort of decline, but you don't want it to be this, like, I'm nowhere near what I was 10 years ago. And, have to be that guy at the gym that's saying, oh, well, back in my day, you should have seen me, like nobody wants to have to do that.
Yeah.
So I think the investing in like our longevity is important. There's a guy at the gym that I play ball with who is kind of an inspiration to me. He's like in his 60s and he started playing at this YMCA. I think we figured out like a month before I was even born. So he's been there forever. And he's in great shape. He beats everybody up and down the court. He minus like a knee injury he had a while ago. He's never really had any big issues. He plays, 2-3 times a week. And I'm just amazed by it. It's like, if I can, like, that is like the gold standard for me. If I can keep doing what I love when I'm at that age, just think about how much better your life is going to be. And not only are you going to be healthier, which is important, but how sad is it if you get to a point where, you're a few years older and you can't do what you used to be able to do? Like, for me, that would be a very sobering thing. That'd be very sad to be like, oh, I can't, this thing that gives me an outlet for stress relief and gives me a lot of pleasure, I'm no longer able to physically do. I think that would be something that for me at least would wreck me. I would lose a lot by not being able to do that. So as hard as it is to think about future selves and not just, want to go get that $10,000 bike or, that really expensive pair of running shoes, investing into our health is going to be something like future you will never be mad that you invested in your future health. You'll look back and be very happy about it.
Yeah, so true. Do you guys look at knees over your toes, guy?
I love Ben. Yeah,
Okay.
Ben. I know Ben fairly well too. I'm a really big fan of his work, and I actually just got done doing some this morning. On Tuesdays and Thursdays I do backward sled pulls.
I've been
So I
doing
was already
those.
doing those.
I posted on
Yes.
Instagram. I've been all into that because we
Nice.
have it at the Bake Club, and I was like, oh, there's a strap there and can go backwards and
Yes.
feel that. Love it. So yeah, I always think of that knees and basketball and just people, all these problems because my left side doesn't fire. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a lot of the stuff he's been doing and integrate that into my routine. So that's good.
Yeah. No, his stuff made a big difference for me. I always grew up with kind of similar to his story where like as a young athlete, I had really bad knee pain. I always attributed it to like, oh, I grew really quickly and, a lot of wear and tear from, being like a 3-sport guy and stuff like that. But, I think those were always just excuses. And as I started getting older, I realized like, when I was like 25, 26, I started realizing like, I'm 25, 26. I shouldn't be feeling this way. This isn't right. And I started doing his stuff probably about 2 years ago. And really once I have a 1-year-old, a son that's about to be 1. And it was especially after he was born where I started realizing like, I really want to be able to do sports with my son as he gets older, and as I get older. And, that's really important to me. So to be honest, I do enjoy the backward sled pulls for some reason. I kind of like that, a little bit of like cruel and unusual punishment. So I kind of a fan, but like, doing a lot of like the calf stuff that he does and some of those other exercises, like the knees over toes lunge, to be honest, I don't really love doing them at all. It's not my favorite thing, but I know that it's going to give a positive return, and the time investment to do it is so small. It's like you can put 15 minutes in your day and dramatically. And for me, it's like I'm able to jump better than I could a couple of years ago. I recover a lot better. My knees don't hurt the way that they did, even when I was a college athlete. Like my knees feel better now at 30 than they did when I was, 20 and had access to, really great facilities and all of these different things. So but can't recommend these. And I think for whether you're just somebody who's not an athlete at all, like just an average gym goer, all the way to like the high level athlete, his stuff is really good and worth looking at.
Yeah, for sure. I'll put that link in the show notes, but you can go to YouTube channel and look up knees over toe guy, but make sure it's his channel because I've seen that there's other people posting their version of it. So go to the original.
Some ripoffs. Yeah.
Well, we're already out of time, but where can people learn more about you and follow your information and get?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm on most of the social media platforms, but Instagram is kind of the primary one where I'm posting most of my content and engaging with people. So that's at the Ketologist. And I also have a newsletter called the Thinking Health newsletter that is, it's kind of a marriage between like health and philosophy. So it's a lot about how we should think about our health, and it's kind of different mental models to help shape the way that we operate as it relates to our health. So that's on Substack, but you can get to it from my Instagram. So those are kind of the main ones. And then BioCoach, I mentioned, is the company that I'm the chief marketing officer for. We're a company that's focused on metabolic health. So we talked a lot about that on this podcast. So if you're somebody who's trying to, go the path of restoring your metabolic health, then you should give us a check over there as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for making time for me today and sharing your great research and insights on everything. It's a continuous learning process, and keep diving into these different topics to have people realize that it's not one size fits all approach. And we need a little more personalization when we figure out how to match our fueling with our training and our recovery program, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate you having me on, and always happy to get to share my story. I'd have to have you do an inverse and have you on my podcast now, because there's a lot of things I'd like to pick your brain about too.
Sure. You might need 2 hours when we get to these topics.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at debbiepotts.net. You can help us to continue to grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.